Hey everybody, it's Ian. Welcome back to Introduction to Folklore, and today we're going to talk about public sector folklore, which is probably a natural place to end a course with. Because the question that you're often asked when you teach folklore, when you suggest that it might be a thing that students might be interested in pursuing, is, well, what use of it? To what can I put it? Because it's not sort of a self-evident thing like, well, if I take sciences, I can be a scientist, or at least bring that scientific understanding to a number of professions. Conversely, it's not a teachable in schools, so it's not like English or history. In addition to the benefits of knowing English and history to begin with, it is it has this sort of innate recognizable market cachet in terms of, well, that's the stuff that I studied in high school. I could be a history teacher or whatever. So the question is, why bother taking folklore to begin with? And I like to think it's a useful exercise. I like to think that it really sort of changes the way that you work. It makes you think about interpersonal communications in a way that you haven't necessarily thought of before, the untested assumptions, the tacit culture that you live in. It makes you pay attention to how people actually live as opposed to the structures that they might imagine or the narratives that they might imagine themselves as living within. And because it's all about the complexity of human interaction and the complexity of meanings and meanings that aren't necessarily set by some kind of authority, but are continually being evolved because they're set by consensus, and because they're set by consensus, they are open to constant rejuvenation and constant distortion. It's the most complicated science, as it were, because it deals with human contingency. But most students who take these courses tend to sort of think, cool. Afterwards, they're like, I am fundamentally changed, but they don't necessarily pursue it as a major or something because they don't necessarily see how it can be folded into folding cash. And when we're talking about the crass capitalism of both the contemporary university and modern life, it's like, how's this going to turn into a job? So then you have public folklore, which is basically taking your folklore training and putting it to use, which is, once you understand the dynamics of tradition, once you understand that the creativity of human beings, of small communities, of things that are sustained for the sake of being sustained, you can start to be in a position to advocate for and support those communities. You can find, and therefore you can find work in museums, you can find work in festivals and folklore societies and a whole bunch of things. Where basically you are working with communities in order to keep these things going. That you are, basically you become an intermediary, not someone who therefore determines what is and what isn't, but basically you work with communities, and the folklorist bent is that you work with communities and try and discover what they are most interested in preserving, and then you advocate for them, and sometimes you will go out and you will recognize and discover something that is dynamic. So this needs to be recorded. This is a fantastic piece of vernacular artistic expression of folk genius, and we want to make sure that it at the very least goes recognized. We want attention drawn to it, and support this idea. And we have this realm called public folklore. So we can sort of begin with the impetus on why one would do this to begin with. And some of it is that folklore as an academic discipline often attracts people who come from folk communities, who have already been enchanted by folk production, perhaps their own, that they are perhaps not necessarily from a marginalized community, but they see traditional music or traditional art or traditional dance as something that is meaningful to them, and then they go off somewhere and try and figure out how to study it. That's one of the directions that North Americans take in general, is that for lack of better options, we go to university to see if we can grasp the things that are most important and dynamic to us. Cool. So whether they are from the folk revival, whether they are, I mean, a lot of the original interest in, it's one of the sort of strange histories of folklore as a discipline, in that a lot of the original flush of people were not from marginalized communities, but had been caught up in that folk revival in the 50s and 60s, and disenchanted with the popular culture of their time or the inherited culture of their privileged groups. They sought out the traditions of others, of this idea that is somehow more authentic, and then they got into the academic pursuit of it, and when they got in the academic pursuit of it, they expanded and realized, oh, it's not simply the folk and the whole thing that we understand, not the folk is commonly understood, but nevertheless, that was one of the rationales that they went into it with. Conversely, many people, irrespective of how they got into the discipline, through field work, they come in contact with people and with the folk, and they might decide, I don't necessarily want to pursue this on the academic level in terms of the professoriate. I want to be an advocate for this and go out either into the field or into folk life programs or into museums or into archives and preserve it this way. And sometimes it happens by accident while one's doing one's academic pursuit, because you are seen as a source of certain kinds of expertise. You are brought in as a help us preserve this. And so some people, even if that isn't their main gig, they become public folklorists on the side, as it were, because they start advocating and helping the communities that they're working with. And then sometimes you can just be working within a folklore program. You could be a folklore student, and someone comes up to you and says, "We have this thing. Can you help us pursue?" So it's not drawn from within in terms of the immediate impetus in terms of the folklorist who is pursuing it. It is not the sort of interaction of the folklorist in the field. It is someone from the communities just standing up and saying, "We would like your assistance," and the folklorist saying, "What can we do?" In the United States, they have what's called the American Folklife Act. And the American Folklife Act spells out that folklife is an important thing and that it needs to be maintained and preserved. It's the interest of the general welfare of the nation to preserve, support, revitalize, and disseminate American folklife traditions and arts. That is an act of Congress from the mid-1970s, which is very cool, which means that every state has a state folklorist and offices that help preserve that. Canada doesn't have the same thing. Canada has similar programs, but it doesn't have a national act that supports it. Quebec and Newfoundland, largely, not coincidentally, because A, they are both sort of recognized distinct nationalities, as it were, and B, because they both are home to graduate programs in folklore at Université de Laval in Quebec City and at Memorial University of Newfoundland. They have provincial programs that are in intangible cultural heritage, which is the term that is often used as sort of analogous to folklife and folklore because of the United Nations Convention on which is another instrument for preserving internationally folklore and folklife traditions. They just avoid the word folklore; they call it intangible cultural heritage. So, but Canada doesn't have that. So you'll find community organizations that can sort of support it, and it's not that the government is disinterested, it's just that it is not one large communal effort in the same way that it is in the United States. That being said, there is a folklorist at the Museum of History, Laura Sanchini, currently. There are many of the provincial museums have something akin to the study of folklife. Many community museums are essentially folklife museums and folklore museums. And so you have that as an aspect of it. And many people, at least in the United States, if they have a folklore degree, distinct possibility that they are not in the academy, that they are working within public sector folklore, that they are working for community organizations, and they are in the field, as it were. And they're doing they might be research active. In fact, they frequently are research active, but just as often when they present their research, it is they're presenting the work that they have been doing in terms of preservation. Um, so more curatorial practices and reflections on them. So what do they actually do? Well, they teach and participate on the vernacular level in folk life and folklore collection, so they help communities become collectors of their own materials. They do a lot of the grunt work in terms of like applying for grants and applying for subventions and so on, because they have that sort of management aspect to it. They keep abreast of best practices, so they try to understand what research ethics is at any given moment and how that dynamic is changing. They are trying to, in terms of practices in terms of preservation, so keeping on track of what is the latest form of the best form of equipment and the best form of potentially archiving, and working within the limitations of a budget with their organization to try and meet those. They create publications. They create publications in terms of booklets, in terms of museum displays, in terms of posters, in terms of the festivals and so on. They identify practices at risk. They are actively going out and into communities and seeing this. As I said earlier, this is something that either this is a new practice that needs to be recorded, that the folk themselves might not recognize this as folklore, as commonly understood. But it's something that is vital and dynamic. You see that a lot in terms of responses to crisis. The reading by Shirey and Lawrence this week is about the collection of murals in the wake of COVID-19 and in wake of George Floyd. And so basically this artistic practice emerged, and folklorists were right there saying, let us collect this, because this is murals are an ephemeral form. They get painted over, they get defaced, they wear away. And new murals emerge when the next reason for communicating through the act of mural painting comes around. So let's make sure that this is preserved in some way. Steve Zeitlin in New York, he when 9/11 happened, he and City Lore, the organization that he runs, immediately went out and started gathering stories, started gathering material culture, started gathering the expressive performances that emerged at this time, because the folk are there. The folk are always in the moment, and they are always doing something that they consider an appropriate response. And the folklorist is hopefully there, hearing that appropriate response and say, look at this act of creation. And lest we forget, let us capture it, let's archive it. They'll archive, they'll capture, they'll collect, even if they don't necessarily know precisely what they are going to be doing with it yet. So like much folklore research, it's there. It's not salvage. It's just that this is a rich trove. Let's collect it, and then we can do the slow grind of figuring out what it means. So there's a very dynamic, responsive aspect to public folklore, and then they advocate. That they are the people who public folklorists are the people who are sort of bilingual, as it were. They immerse themselves in the vernacular of the group that they are understanding and advocating for, so that they can rationalize and understand what is vital to this community. And then they can fundamentally translate it to the language of the academy, to the language of the state, to the language of grant writing. And so that's the sort of, again, intermediary position that they take. They're not putting themselves in between in order to gatekeep. They're putting themselves in between in order to facilitate these two worlds that might not necessarily speak to each other that much: the academy and the folk, the government and the folk, the arts agencies and the folk. So that's what they do. And one of the things that almost inevitably happens is that the communities that are being represented in folk life and folklore programs in the public sector are often historically not marginalized communities. They're marginalized. They don't. I mean, their performances are really like most folk cultures. They are sustained by virtue of the actions and the impulses and the desires for it to be sustained by the folk themselves, which can start to be difficult within contemporary capitalist societies because there are expenses and there are draws of doing something differently, more accessible, more easily staged, participating more passively in a culture that's being presented to you as opposed to actively in one that you have to continually generate yourself. And so these communities, they are often, as I say, marginalized in some way. So there is a thin line between advocating for the cultural position of these communities, or the cultural performances of these communities, and recognizing that they have, dynamic pieces of human genius within them, while at the same time, and the thin line is between advocating for the communities in terms of their rights, their economic sustainability, their cultural performances. So there's often a, for lack of a better word, a social justice motivation that is almost inevitably tied in to the group. And that, well, one of the reasons that this thing cannot be sustained is this community is so overtaxed by being overworked and underwaged, and therefore let's also help in that community. And I don't actually see a problem with that. I think we have on two different levels. One, we should be helping people as much as we can, and two, if we are going to take these traditions seriously, we cannot pretend that they exist independent of the real world and the real people who actually do them. And so if we want them to persist, which we do, we have to advocate for the people who are doing them. And so I don't see a disjuncture there. It's in the same way that if we want fine arts to exist, we need to sustain fine art institutions. If we want symphonies to exist, we need to make sure that people have the leisure and the opportunity to write symphonies until such time as they are economically viable. If we want to have a film industry, we have to sustain the film industry until it becomes economically viable. So too, if we want to have rug hooking and Cheticamp, if we want to have fiddle music, if we want to have these things that are culturally, that we make the claim are culturally important. And by we, I'm not talking about the folklorists themselves. I'm talking about sort of, society. If we want to do this, if we want to keep these things going, we have to recognize that there are real people who are doing that, and we need to participate in that. So that is kind of what public sector folklore is. It is something that it is something that really works. It's something that is. There has historically been a little bit of a divide in the academy between academics and public sector folklorists, in large part because the academy is often filled with snobs, people who are very much like me, and like, well, that's that sort of there's not enough theory, or there's not enough new discovery or something. You can listen to them. I wouldn't. I think that the work the public sector folklorists do is different from the work that ivory tower folklorists like myself end up doing. But they're different parts of the same basic collaborative project. And they are vital, and they are necessary, if that isn't a redundancy. And what's more, the Academy should be advocating for more of this work, in large part so that when we are graduating students, they have greater opportunities to pursue their to practice their studies in the real world. So there you go. So the question of the week is, knowing what you now know, this being the end of the semester, what would you see as a way of applying your understanding of folklore, however your understanding of folklore has been formed, in real-world contexts to help facilitate or protect traditional practice? Anyway, I will talk to you soon. Be well. Semester's almost over. Fun. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.